Richard the Lionheart, hero king or complete fool? Why do English people hold up two fingers at someone who pissed them off? And if you make your wife mad enough, will she raise an army and have you murdered? The Kings and Queens of England. Part 3. The Plantagenets kill everybody. After years of war over who should wear the crown, King Stephen agreed that his rival, Empress Matilda's son, Henry, could have the job. That conflict was over, but the warrior kings of the Middle Ages were hardly done with bloodshed. For the next 300 years, they would battle Muslims in crusades, other European rulers, and each other. The House of Plantagenet, Henry II. At 21, Henry was crowned in a double coronation with his wife, 33-year-old Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor had already been married to King Louis VII of France, but Louis was extremely pious and had no interest in sex, so their marriage was annulled. Eleanor began an affair with and eventually married the much younger Henry, and she worked hard to help him secure the crown. With their combined lands, the power couple ruled nearly half of France in addition to England. Henry also invaded Ireland, claiming that he was under orders from the Pope to reform their church. He was named Lord of Ireland, beginning an evolution of English rule over Ireland that still exists today. Henry appointed his good friend and son of a London merchant, Thomas Becket, to head the Exchequer, creating a position that was the forerunner to the Prime Minister. Together they reformed currency and began a system of trial by jury. Henry was concerned that the power of the church was greater than his own, so when the Bishop of Canterbury, head of the English church, died, the king appointed Becket, who he thought was his man. Becket turned on Henry and became a religious fanatic. He seized power from Henry and fired churchmen who opposed him. In turmoil over the betrayal, Henry was reported to have said, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" And 4 loyal knights took him at his word, went to the cathedral and sliced off the top of Becket's head. Henry feared the Pope would excommunicate him over the murder and destroy his kingdom. He prostrated himself at the altar of Canterbury and was publicly whipped to save himself from ruin. It worked, and the kingdom was saved. By this time, Henry and Eleanor had drifted apart, and she had returned to Aquitaine. She encouraged her sons to rebel against their father and seize the crown for themselves. Only the youngest, John, remained loyal. Fearing that John would be named successor, the eldest, Richard, went to battle against his father and won. After the defeat, King Henry had a list of Richard's supporters read to him, and the first name on the list was John's. Henry had been betrayed. He was heartbroken and died a few days later at 56. Richard I. Richard, known as the Lionheart, was a handsome man and a fierce warrior, but a foolish romantic who pictured himself as a storybook hero. He had no interest in the drudgery of governing and left his mother, Eleanor, in charge while he went on crusade to try and take the holy city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. Richard was away from home for years, but his crusade was unsuccessful. The king decided to make the journey home an adventure. He traveled unguarded and in a weak disguise, and of course was captured by the Duke of Austria, who held him for ransom for £100,000, about 8 years' tax income for the English government. Richard's folly nearly bankrupted the country. Later, during a siege in France, Richard, who clearly thought he was invincible, was walking around the battlefield with no armor when an arrow struck him. The wound became gangrenous and the king died in his mother's arms. He had been king for 9 years but spent only 6 months in England. Despite his folly, he got his wish and was portrayed as a hero in the Robin Hood stories, while his brother John was portrayed as a villain grasping at power. John was called Lackland because when the lands were divided up between his brothers, there was nothing left for him. When his father was named Lord of Ireland, he granted that title to John. When John became King of England, the Irish title was incorporated into the Crown of England. By the time Richard died, John was the eldest remaining son. However, the deceased middle brother, Geoffrey, had a 13-year-old son whom the French believed to be the rightful king. John defeated the French force, captured his nephew, and drowned the boy. The French were so outraged by the murder that they drove John out of all the French territories that had long been governed by English kings. John also had to contend with a very aggressive pope, Innocent III, who demanded that all kings of Europe submit to him. John refused. He was excommunicated and therefore forced to surrender to the pope. A group of powerful barons forced John into signing a document called the Magna Carta, which laid out in writing limitations to the power of the king and granted power to the nobles. The Magna Carta was the precursor to the modern Constitution. After the forced signing, John was so furious that he marched through the country at the head of a hired foreign army, crushing the barons and destroying their property. The barons, equally furious, offered the crown of England to Louis, son of the King of France, who rode north to defeat John's army. In preparation for the battle, John had to move his baggage across an estuary, a strip of land only revealed when the tide was out. Due to a miscalculation of the tides, all of John's wealth, including the crown jewels, were washed out to sea. Devastated, John escaped to a local monastery. While there, the monks offered him beer, which drowned his sorrows and also gave him dysentery. He died at age 50. Louis I. Meanwhile, in London, Louis of France was making himself unpopular by offering government positions to his friends from home rather than the English barons who had put him on the throne. The barons took back his acclamation as king, and due to this technicality, he is usually not counted as a king of England. Henry III. In Louis's place, the throne went to King John's 9-year-old son, Henry. His regent, the adult who ruled on his behalf, was William Marshal, a famous, popular, and unusually honest and loyal knight. Marshal pushed Louis out of the country for good. After the faithful William Marshal died, Henry grew up under the thumb of the barons. As an adult, he was wrapped around his wife, Eleanor of Provence's little finger. Henry spent buckets of money on his queen's relatives' foreign wars, causing Londoners to riot against the queen, shouting, "Drown the witch." The crisis led to civil war, during which a radical baron, Simon de Montfort, who happened to be Henry's brother-in-law, captured both Henry and his son Edward. De Montfort essentially ruled the country and called the first English Parliament, with both nobles and commoners represented from around the kingdom. While out riding on horseback, the imprisoned Prince Edward was able to give his guards the slip and escape. He raised an army and attacked de Montfort, killing and dismembering him on the battlefield. Though his father was still technically king, Prince Edward was really in charge. He wisely kept Parliament, recognizing the country would no longer stand for autocratic rule. Henry III died at 69, having occupied the throne for 58 years, but never really ruling. Edward I. Edward, called Longshanks because of his height, was a warrior king. He was the first since the Norman conquest to use English as his primary language, and he strived to tie national pride to his rule. He wanted to be seen as the new King Arthur, the mythological English hero king who received his mandate to rule from God when he pulled the sword from the stone. Edward conducted a ceremony in which he and his queen, Eleanor of Castile, carried bones said to be those of Arthur and his wife Guinevere to a magnificent new tomb. This PR stunt worked well, gave him the support of the people, and allowed him to raise taxes to pay for his favorite pastime, war. Edward was a brutal king. He conquered Wales and spiked the Welsh princes' heads on the Tower of London. He taxed the Jewish moneylenders dry and then made the Jewish people a scapegoat. He forced them to wear yellow stars, publicly executed hundreds of their leaders, and finally expelled all the Jews from the country. Sound familiar? When his wife Eleanor died, worn out after 16 childbirths, he made her death a public spectacle of mourning. Her body was carried from Lincoln to London, and a memorial cross was erected at 12 stops along the way. Next, he set his sights north to Scotland. He imprisoned King Alexander III and stole the Stone of Scone, a mythical stone on which kings of Scotland were crowned. Edward placed the stone in his own coronation chair, where it is still used today. Scottish warrior William Wallace led an army against Edward, and the English were pushed out of Scotland. At the end of his life, Edward commanded that his heart and bones should be carried at the head of the army that would march north to defeat Scotland once and for all. He didn't get his wish. Edward II. This Edward had no interest in war, much to his father's devastation. Edward Sr. had tried to change his son's character by taking him on campaign and assigning him a squire who excelled at tournaments. Piers Gaveston. This backfired spectacularly when Edward and Gaveston fell in love. When Edward took the throne, Gaveston flaunted his influence over the king and wore royal purple and the queen's wedding jewelry to Edward's coronation. This so enraged the nobles that they tracked Gaveston down in the woods, ran him through with swords, and beheaded him. The king was devastated. Edward attempted a stand against the new King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce, but lost spectacularly. On top of that, climate change caused a year of devastating famine throughout the country. Churchmen blamed England's despair on the king's immorality. Edward's queen, Isabella, known as the She-Wolf of France, raised an army with her lover, Roger Mortimer. They invaded England, imprisoned Edward, and put his young son on the throne. While in prison, the king was abused and starved. After a few weeks, he still clung to life, so his wife had him murdered in a way that would show no marks on the body of the king. He was impaled through the anus with a red-hot poker. Edward III. At 15, King Edward was controlled by his mother, Isabella of France, and her lover, Mortimer. At 18, Edward hatched a plot. He and a band of knights seized his controllers. Mortimer was hanged and Isabella imprisoned. Now wielding the power of the king, the tall and handsome Edward decided to go to war. France was siding with Scotland against England and had blocked England's largest export, wool, from entering the continent. Rather than rally a few noble knights, as previous kings had done, Edward raised taxes and hired a professional army of skilled warriors, including the famous and deadly English archers. They originated the English vulgarity of displaying one's index and middle finger. When English archers were unlucky enough to be captured by the French, these digits were regularly cut off. Showing these fingers intact was a way of saying, "You haven't captured me." Edward easily conquered northern France, and when he captured Calais, he commanded that 6 leaders present him the keys to the city, barefoot, with nooses around their necks, ready to be hanged. The queen, Philippa of Hainault, fell to her knees and begged for their lives, and Edward acquiesced. In 1348, England was struck by the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. Though the people saw the plague as God's punishment, it was actually spread by fleas that lived on the large rat population. Victims developed black swellings and died within days of infection. More than a third of the population was lost. As the country was decimated by plague, the only way for the king and the army to bring in money was to continue pillaging and ransoming in France. So the battles raged on. It came to be known as the 100 Years' War. The king's eldest son, Edward, was called the Black Prince because of the color of his shield. He was a spectacular military leader and became a hero of the wars. While on campaign in Spain, most of the army, including the prince, contracted dysentery. He survived and was able to make it home, but his health was ruined. He lived another 10 years of debilitating illness and died in 1376. In 1377, King Edward himself died. The king had 3 surviving adult sons, all of whom had their eye on the throne their brother had left open. But it was the Black Prince's 10-year-old son Richard who had the rightful claim. In the warrior Middle Ages, a young king had a target on his back. Richard's uncles and cousins' plots against him would culminate in the greatest English conflict of the Middle Ages, the War of the Roses. Check out the next video to find out, were 2 young princes really murdered in the Tower of London? Was Richard III really hunchbacked? And how did incest end a century of war?